Well, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope podcast, and I'm your host, Danielle Richardson. And I'm very excited because I'm speaking with Cork Graham today. That's his author name. His name is Frederick Graham, but he goes by Cork Graham, very similar. But what's really cool is before we started this interview, I got to talk to him for a pretty lengthy amount of time, which is not usual for me for most of the interviewees I have. It's a shorter time. And he has such a passion for helping people to know the truth about the world and to critically think. And I think that's a great thing. I think it's something we need. And so I'm really excited to talk with him. But how I found him was I was researching war correspondence. It was something I wanted to do when I was in college, and I didn't do that. I took a different path. But I have always had such a heart for war correspondents, especially those who would photograph war and who could be there. Because as somebody who's, living comfortably in my home, I don't, you see the war on the TV or you see the war in the news, but I'm never there. And so I don't actually know what's going on. I don't actually know what it's like unless I get to talk to somebody who's been there and experienced it. And I think it's always important to take a time to, kind of figure out what is war like and what are the dynamics and how does that affect people. And Cork was actually a teenager when he was actually taken by the Vietnamese military. When he went to Vietnam, he was charged with illegally entering because he was there kind of twofold. The mission was to find some lost treasure that was potentially there, but at the same time, they were hoping they could find some people who were missing in action. So it was kind of a dual thing going on. And he was only a teenager at the time. He was a photojournalist. And then he just got captured right away and was in a prison camp for almost a year. And he was mentally tortured and he was accused of being a spy for the CIA, which if he wasn't. And then from there, he was finally released, made headlines all over the US for the experience he had gone through. And then he ended up going to war in Central America, served some time there as well. And so he's just had a bunch of experience with war, but also the effects of it. He's helped to counsel soldiers who've gone through PTSD because that's something he experienced very severely himself. He now lives in Alaska and he loves nature. He's written international bestsellers. If you want to, figure out his memoir, it's called The Bamboo Chest. That's going to go into so much more detail than this interview will allow, but that will be able to give you a great idea of who he is. He has a website, he has lots of socials. You just type him in and you'll find him. And then I'll also have a link below the podcast for you to check out as well. But Cork, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's a gift to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great chance to talk about history.
Yeah, so I want to start out because I want to ask you, as an 18-year-old, I think in America especially, I'm not sure how many 18-year-olds are actually experiencing war, like outside of the US, where people are experiencing bombings every day and getting a real glimpse of war. But as an 18-year-old, now in America, most 18-year-olds, in the sense of security and safety internationally, are pretty good, and they're not really experiencing anything like war in the US. And I wanted to ask you, as an 18-year-old, when you were about to go into Vietnam and you're going on this mission, which in some ways feels like an adventure novel, but at the same time, I mean, that's pretty terrifying, I would think. Like, what were your thoughts? Like, were you, like, I know you were excited because you say that on your, website, but at the same time, like, being an 18-year-old and about to go into war and potentially find people who've been missing in action and change lives, like, how did that feel?
Well, the thing about it is, I was going home. I was raised. My first memories of life were the Tet Offensive of 1968 in Saigon, because
Yeah.
my dad was working there as an expat businessman, and that actually is what created the traumas that I would actually go and heal while I was in solitary confinement in prison. And what it has taught me is that we all have a calling within ourselves. Like it's kind of like each soul that's on this planet has a specific calling. And when life goes well for you, in terms of what you're really supposed to be doing, you know it and you go and do it. And if it's
Hmm.
not, for instance, at that time in my life, I was an officer candidate. I was going to be a Marine jet pilot. I was at UC Berkeley. At the ROTC. I went to my indoctrination over at Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida. I'd come back from that, but since high school, I mean, I remember looking at my friend's yearbook from high school, and I said, "See you in Saigon." I used to write "See you in Saigon" during the last 2 years of high school. So I was already at that point that something is calling me to go back there. And for the soul, for me to go and do my healing, the vehicle was to go look for MIAs. The physical vehicle for me to actually get there was when you're on your path, it's kind of like the power of myth, Joseph Campbell. So Joseph Campbell talks about that the hero's journey, when you're on your right path, the wizards and the princes and princesses will appear to help and assist you along your path of soul or self discovery.
Right.
And that's what happened for me. So it's like, didn't know how to use a camera, bought a camera like 2 weeks before I left. Um, but I realized when I was taking photographs and I would take them to the bureau, like for AP. So Dennis Gray was the bureau chief um, at Associated Press. There was Jim Wolfe was the bureau chief for Agence France Presse. And I would go and, it's just like, I'm looking for a job, knock, knock, knock.
Yeah.
We don't really have anything happening. And then I talked to everybody. These guys had covered Vietnam during the war. So, boy, if you were here 20, 30 years ago, 10 years ago even, we would have had you, we'd be sending you out. But everything had died down. But it was interesting that even though the media was all focused on the Middle East and Lebanon and all this stuff that was happening in the Middle East, the wars were still going on in Southeast Asia. The Khmer Rouge were on the border. The Vietnamese had kicked the Khmer Rouge to the border with Thailand. The Pathet Lao were still hunting down the hill people, the Hmong hill tribes. To the point that, like in Ban Vanai was the refugee camp up in northern Thailand, and that was my first entry into combat, which was just horrific. Which was to cross that river, the Mekong River, with these kids. I was 18 years old. Here are these combat veterans who were 15 and they'd already had 2 years in combat carrying an AK-47. Just because we're not there doesn't mean it's not happening. And just because, and that's why, as more and more that's why I'm not really into reporting unless I'm reporting from myself, for myself, to my audience, to get people to ask questions. You should be asking questions all the time. In this country, our education system taught us that until, for sure, by my generation, it was gone. But I talked to my dad. I remember when I was in college, and I asked my dad. My dad was born in 1930, so he was of the quote. If you read, what was that book? It talks about generations. Do you know that one? But written by two authors. It's used all the time. About how cycles go through, like the life cycle of a country, like 250 years of a democracy, 1,000 years in an empire. Um,
Like there's kind of a circle of life for nations, is what
there's
you're
a
saying, right?
like with living beings, there's a circle of life with governments and
Okay.
nations. You're born, you live a good life, and then you age, and then you die, and then it goes, and then it becomes something else. Something else happens, whether it's taken over or it evolves within itself. But in there, they label my dad's generation as a silent generation, and the generation before that was the greatest generation, the World War II generation. And it's interesting because that's only 2 or 3 years separation. But it's really interesting that when you talk to the silent generation, they don't talk with bravado the way the guys who were landing at Normandy or fighting in the Pacific talk about World War II. The ones
Yeah.
who talk, first of all, most people don't want to talk, and that's why it's called the Forgotten War. It's interesting that my father's generation's war was the Forgotten War, and my generation's war was the Secret War, Reagan's secret war that nobody even knows what happened. And how important and how dangerous it was for the United States as a free country during the 80s, and what the peace that was brought about by Reagan was actually monumental when we did negotiate with the Soviet Union, and actually that negotiation allowed the Soviet Union to collapse on itself. It basically imploded because of the system. The system itself can't support itself because it lives off its people, as compared to when you have a true democratic republic. It's supposed to grow out as a tree from the inside out, as compared to a press from the outside in, and that's what socialism and communism are. They thrive on. That's why they go to a country and then nobody wants to work, nobody wants to expand, nobody wants to be creative, and then it just collapses on itself. And that's what happened during the 80s. After years, after decades of its creation under the Bolsheviks in reality in Russia. But so the fighting that they had in Southeast Asia at that time enabled me to here. Before I even left, I heard a story about Colonel Bogreitz, and Colonel Bogreitz was sneaking in to Laos after the American MIAs. These were servicemen who were left at the end of the war. And so young people always want a cause because you want to be part of something bigger. When you're
Yeah.
young and you have to define you.
It's
I'm
true.
older now. I've defined my life. I'm happy with my life. I don't need to define myself. That's why you don't go after old people when you're trying to get them into a movement. You definitely go after the kids. You go after the 15 to 28-year-olds because it's prime. It's perfect. And in this situation, it was just a cause that hit me because I had lived in Vietnam. I knew servicemen when they were teenagers. Now they're great grandfathers or they're gone. But I remember them as teenagers, drafted. And some of them did not make it back. And some of them just disappeared. And I've had conversations with people about, well, what happened to the MIAs? And I'm not invited to these MIA conventions, even back in the 80s. Oh, they never would call me because they know what I would say, which is they got all killed. If they weren't dead from just natural causes, being in the horrific conditions that they were in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, then by the time that Vietnam says these are all your prisoners, if there were any prisoners left at that time, they had to be killed. They had to be executed because the embarrassment and the conflict that would occur for reparations that Vietnam was expecting. But the reparations never came because of Nixon and everything that happened with Watergate. And Ford, it was a clean slate. And that's actually one of the reasons that there was no funding to help the South Vietnamese defend themselves against the North Vietnamese when they came down and took over. And that led to the boat refugees. And those were the boat refugees I saw coming out of Vietnam as we were sneaking in. That was the wild part, of seeing these boats still coming and leaving. People who moved to Chatsworth, California, big Vietnamese community in Southern California. Some came to San Francisco. Others went to Paris. Some went to London. But a lot went to France because, like my first language, I'm a polyglot for a variety of reasons. One's that my mother's from Ecuador. So my first language before my mother was able to speak English. So by the time my brother was born, so that's 3 years, I don't have an accent when I speak Spanish. My brother does. He has an American accent. I don't have an accent. Teaches you things about the imprinting when people speak a language. So my first language was Spanish. Then I learned English, and then we moved to Vietnam, and my next language was French. And actually, it was Vietnamese because the first words I came back was "Choi oi," which is Vietnamese for "damn it." So my parents heard that and go, "What are they teaching you about that French?" So I was put in a French Catholic school for kindergarten, and then I went to the Phoenix Study Group, which was the big American school system set up in Saigon for expats, American expats. So at that time, the vehicle was for me was to go in and try and find the American MIs in Laos. and that started petering away because Greitz was kicked out of the country. There was a big court trial. The idea that he was sneaking in from Thailand. Thailand couldn't publicly. Privately, if you talk to people who are officials in the government, they were actually wholeheartedly for Greitz going in and trying to find the MIAs. But publicly, they couldn't do that because they share borders with Laos. So they couldn't be known because that's could be interpreted as, quote, an act of war or an act of espionage between Thailand and Laos, and they couldn't have that. So that put the kibosh on that. So then I said that the doorway is open. You will meet the princes and the wizards and the magicians who will provide you the magic sword, like for Arthur. Arthur needed a sword to become the king of England. Well, it was Merlin who gave it to him. So that's the myth of the hero's journey. Everybody is a hero within their own life journey. So I met, right when I got there, I met John Everingham. I learned about John Everingham because I was actually, and I wrote this about in the book, I'm right there, SFO. My dad's looking at me and says, "Why are you doing this?" And I'm like, I have to go. I have to go. And
So when
no
you
matter how
got
bad it's going to
caught,
be,
were
oh,
you
you,
surprised?
what's that?
When you got caught, like, were you surprised or were you kind of like,
Oh, when I got caught in
yeah,
Vietnam, oh no, there was no surprise because
yeah.
when we came in on the boat and there was a Vietnamese fisherman. It's broad daylight. We were supposed to come in at night. That's what you're supposed to do when you do these kind of insertions. The boat engine did not work. And so we're all fiddling, and I finally got the thing going because what happened, the choke on it, so the fuel was choked off. And so I got it open, and that got the fuel to get. So we were just floating out there in the Thai Gulf after we separated from the mother boat. I'm going, I do not want to die out here. And that's interesting because it turned up into the lies from the from Hanoi to State Department and to my family, which is that I was not in Vietnam. So for 3 months until there were Thai prisoners at our prison were released and sent back to Thailand who verified we were in that same prison. They were telling everybody that they didn't have us. And so I could have disappeared at that time. People disappear. And that's the thing about it. People, the gravity of the situation, of understanding that if you're going to walk this path, it is a very dangerous, dangerous path. When we're young, we have a sense of invincibility. As we get older and we get beat up more from all
But,
those experiences. I mean,
but you,
I've got 2 TBIs. I've got, before TBIs were cool, like GWAT, everybody started talking about TBIs. I got one from a friendly fire of a bombing in El Salvador because they dropped a bomb too close to us. I got another one when they attacked the third Brigade in San Miguel, and they were dropping mortars in on us. I almost lost my lower left leg during that attack. It was basically a base overrun in 1986 in July. Yeah. Um,
but
but
when
I
you got captured and were put into prison, I mean, you probably through that, because I know you say that during that 11-month experience in prison,
mhm.
you were trying to heal actually from PTSD to experience as a kid. But
And
also
I didn't
this,
know.
I was just gonna say, but also like you probably grew up real fast in those 11 months
Mhm.
as well because you're confronting life or death. You don't know if you're gonna go home.
Well, the other thing too is that trauma causes people to grow up, and I already been traumatized from my childhood in Vietnam. So my attitude and interactions with my friends in high school was I have friends and we interact and we can play. It was the playfulness of football and soccer and all kind of stuff, and studying to pass so we could get accepted to a university. But there was always a separation, which is you're reading this stuff in these history books, and a lot of the history that I saw is not even in these books. I saw the Tet Offensive. I saw the May Offensive, which was actually bloodier. It wasn't until so I have all these old friends, and a lot of them are passing away who were combat correspondents, war correspondents from Vietnam. Zaylen Grant, I got to check and see if he's even still alive. But Zip, that was the nickname. His nickname is Zip. Um, Zip Grant. he was a Army intelligence officer, and then after that, after he got out of the Army, he was totally disgusted with what he saw happening in Vietnam. Became a reporter for Newsweek, and then he worked for a bunch of other ones. And then he married a French doctor, and she and he, like us, living in the country, but he was living in France, for years. And now, last time I talked with him, he moved into Paris. He had to because of his age. But Zip told me, he says, you know what? Yeah, everybody who watched Walter Cronkite, reporting from the streets of Saigon, saying, we're losing the war here in Vietnam. He says that was nothing. That the Tet Offensive was nothing in relation to the May Offensive, because in the Tet Offensive, General Yap and all the Politburo up in Hanoi, their intention was they were going to create conflict, attack the cities, and then they would rally all the South Vietnamese to kick out the American imperialists. And they were shocked and embarrassed that nobody in South Vietnam wanted to join us. We don't want to be communists. That's why we're down here, and that's why you guys are up there. So then the May Offensive came in. So January was the Tet Offensive of '68. The May Offensive was in May or called Little Tet, which was in May of 1968. And during that one, they said, this time, kill everybody. We're not going to get anybody to join us, so just kill everybody. And so it was actually one of the bloodiest battles in Vietnam during the war. And that's actually why 1968 is known as the most horrific year, one of the most horrific years of the fighting in Vietnam, because of how it worked out and how it played out and the effect of that. And one of the things that hit me was if you Google Zaylen Grant and Vietnam and war, his article will come up. He'll write, and he's got a picture of him and his buddy Terry. Forget Terry's last name. They're both in a white press Jeep. It said TV or press or whatever on thing. It was kind of a joke. But they're stacked like cordwood, or all these bodies of about 7 reporters who were gunned down at this roadblock in Saigon. And they went to go get those bodies and bring them back. And they were in rigor mortis, so that they were like logs in there. But that photograph just showed the intensity of how much more the fighting was than the more famous one, which is Colonel, I forget his last name, but it's the Vietnamese colonel who shoots the Viet Cong in the head. And who knows the real story about what happened to the friend of that colonel. And that's the reason he executed that guy, that Viet Cong, right there on the spot. Because that Viet Cong and his unit, his squad, had gone to the house of the friend of that colonel and killed everybody. Killed his friend, killed the friend's wife, killed all the kids, murdered them right there in their house.
What
And
did you, when you were in the prison, was there a scene that specifically kept coming back to you from that time that you took the longest, you think, to process?
So when you see combat, it's almost, and you're not really involved, and especially as a child, you're not really. And it's interesting because I've been around other people who've never been in combat, and we're in combat together, and it's their first time. And I look at them, and I realize what's happening. It's like a child being brought to a new environment, and it's a shocking environment. So there's that look of shock. Even if they think they're ready for it, they're not ready for it. Nobody is ready for it. It just depends on, it's kind of like when somebody says someone's a natural. I was a natural for war. I had a CEO one day in Silicon Valley, and I told him, he said, you know what, I've been at war from the age of 3 until the age of 26, which is when I came back from Central America. When I came here for the first time, and I healed everything. I even went back in through Vietnam, and I went back through Central America, and I did the healing and retrospection of those events in my life. That's when I made peace. But it took, even with the healing that I did in prison, I had not gone over the idea of there's an attraction to combat. I have no attraction to combat anymore, but I did up until I was 26, and that was the end of the war in Central America. And you're addicted to it, and I recognize this and other people who are correspondents now who are friends of mine who are active in either my age or younger. I got one friend who's a photographer in LA, and he's covering all the riots. And he and I had a mutual friend who was Tim Page. Tim Page, you probably know Tim Page if you look back at Tim Page and Sean Flynn and Dana Stone. So Tim Page, and he just passed 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But he was the one who was quoted as the quote that carried with him, and I don't know how he really felt about it because he would never say it, is the guy who makes war sexy because of his photography. And if you look at his pictures, they're like, whoa. But it's a very ugly thing that you're looking at. You're seeing this destruction, either physically of somebody or the emotional and inner soul destruction of someone. Part of the work that I when I was doing heavy duty work for the American Indian community in San Francisco for Friendship House, my specialty. So I worked with clients for drug and alcohol rehab, but those are really just the symptoms.
Yeah.
The problem is the trauma.
Yeah.
And as I was working through the trauma, I realized that, God, how's the way to describe this? There's two parts to it, which is there's the attraction to it, and there's the experience of it, and then there's the gleaning of all the different lessons that you can pull back from that experience. Some people never get out of that, and they're always traumatized, and they always will react in a certain way. Like for a long time, backfires in vehicles used to get me. I would almost be like hitting the deck until I realized I'm not in war. I'm at home. I don't have to. And it always hits you. How a flashback hits you is when you are not thinking about combat or being in that time. It's actually where you're just totally relaxed, but that's why it's a mental anchor. It's an anchor. So that sound is so close. Like if you have somebody who's upstairs and they bang the legs of a chair or a table against the floor up above you, and it's a thump. Yeah. That's like a mortar round going off. When it takes off, you thump, and that will bring you back into that situation. When I was working with women who were traumatized, how they were touched, if they were attacked, by an abusive partner. Depending on what you would interpret as thinking, well, wow, that's just a loving touch. But if it's a touch from someone who's been abusing them all their life, it's not a loving touch, right? So it affects them in a different way, and that's that understanding of how this plays out in people. And then actually, how does it play out that it can be fed? And this is actually one of the reasons like war movies come out. I remember overhearing a conversation between two, my mother and a significant other at the time. And my mom says, why does he keep on watching those movies? Why does he keep on watching those movies? And it hit me right. I heard that because I wasn't in the conversation, but I could hear it. And this was when I had just gone back, and it hit me because I said, and the answer I got was, it's because I'm looking for something. I'm looking to interpret what I experienced. And when movies are used in that way, it can be healing. But I don't like to really watch war movies now, except maybe from a historical point of view, when before they used to have an emotional point of view. Right. And they would affect me. And sometimes I just had to stop. And there are movies that I watch now. I get into it for a second. And it's just like, nope, we're not going to do it. No, we're not going down this road. And I'll just turn it off because there's no reason. Because your subconscious doesn't know the difference between reality and created reality. And especially when you're watching a movie, because a movie is designed to affect your emotions and give you the emotions you experience if you were there, because you're from a visual and an audio point of view, because you're hearing the sounds and you're seeing.
Right.
And
so even though you've experienced profound healing from what you've gone through, you still have your triggers that you have to be aware of that could happen.
Oh, yeah. And that's the difference, is recognizing the triggers. And most of the time you catch them and sometimes you don't. And I have to watch about things. Am I angry about this situation right now of what is happening? Or am I angry because of um, a bunch of dominoes through my life that have all now just rolled over and hit me at that same amount. That's at that same point in time because of this trigger. It was that trigger, the finger that flicked that domino. That wasn't just the event, that one domino. It's all those dominoes from previous events that I've experienced in my life, all falling down on me at that very moment and hitting me emotionally. That my rage and anger would be that much more, or my sadness would be that much more. Am I watching a movie that I know it's a movie? So now I get into the point that when I do watch movies, I'm always, there's a subconscious now that says, well, it's all fake. It's all fake.
Right.
But there are movies I won't watch like We Were Soldiers. I mean, because Joe Galloway was a really good friend of mine for years. And I watched that movie once. Don't want to watch it again because I saw it and I heard the stories directly from Joe. And for him, I listened because it was for him. I don't need to hear him. When I was a counselor, I listened, and it's a clinical environment. I'm listening for them. But I also, when you're working with someone as a counselor or a therapist, you have to go where they are to meet them. You can't just have them like flounder and float out at sea. You have to swim out and meet them at least halfway and then start bringing them to shore, which
Yeah.
means you have to go there yourself, which emotionally is that rapport.
Yeah.
And that's why I like the difference. Okay, so I can talk to somebody who was in Vietnam. I can talk to somebody who was in GWAT. I have friends who contact me all the time. I had no interest of going into the Middle East whatsoever, ever. A lot of my friends did, and they came back from that, and they're always, when they need someone to talk to, they call me. And I talk to them and I said, well, try this, try this, try this, and try this. And a lot of times it's just like, I just need to talk to you. And I go, sure. And I'll listen. And that's the thing that you do is you just listen. It's interesting because I mean you're in the business of listening, so I'm curious because you're a good interviewer. You have an ability to connect with your guest, with your interviewee. Because as I said, we talked about, I've listened to all your great interviews previously, and the reason is because you can go where they are. You can walk into their land and then come back,
Mhm.
and that's the key: is to walk into the land but get back. Some people don't get back.
Well, I that's something I want to
It,
ask. I wanted to say, like, first of all, I want to say when I was reading that too, when I was reading on your website and your biography about that, I thought that was amazing that you can, it's such an act of love that you have to be able to do that. Because, like you said, some people they're not in that journey yet. And they're like, I can't meet you there. It's too hard for me. Like, if I go there with you, we're both going to flounder. Like,
yeah.
nobody's going to be solid. Um, but I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about mental things here, when you were in the prison, when you're looking back now, do you ever wish it had been more physical than had been mental, or do you think that would have made much of a difference?
What, the beatings?
Well, because I know when I was researching it, it seemed like the mental was the big thing you focused on.
Oh yeah.
So I
Oh yeah. But
wasn't sure if you
yeah.
preferred, you were like, well, I wish there had been no mental and more of this, or if there had been, or if you preferred the mental to the physical. I know it's a weird question, but if like you
I
had
don't
to choose.
towards Vietnam. Even the North Vietnamese. It's not my country. It's not my country. They're Vietnamese. They can do whatever they want. That's their country. In the same way that I'm an American. These are two different countries. I have to deal with the issues of America. The Vietnamese have to deal with the issues of Vietnam. We talked about conspiracies. We talk into conspiracies of how Vietnam happened. And this isn't even a conspiracy because we know for a fact right now that the start of the Vietnam War was totally fabricated. And it was fabricated by the military industrial complex. And I know that from a global level of news, having studied and researched the conversations of LBJ and the questions about the execution or the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Why exactly did that happen? Variety of reasons, but I have always been taught follow the money. And
Not bad advice.
not bad advice. It's good to make your own money, but not at the cost of lives like that. And that's what they did. And the Gulf of Tonkin incident is the one that they always talk about, the Gulf of Tonkin. I was friends with Ace Lyons. Ace Lyons was an admiral under Reagan. And Ace was always angry about one thing only. This was a guy who was in the Merchant Marine during World War II, then went into the U.S. Navy, became an admiral, and Ace had said, "We knew," meaning we knew where the Japanese were, where they were going, and what they were going to do, and nothing was done. One thing was done: all our aircraft carriers that were in Pearl Harbor, they were taken out. Because it's a lot easier to build a fleet of small boats than it is to build an aircraft carrier. So they got all their aircraft carrier out. And so we were set up to get into World War II. We were set up to get into Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, I say on a global level, you can go and read about all the information. Well, my direct debriefer at Pentagon at the JCRC, which is the Joint Casualty Resolution Center for the Pentagon, DIA, POW, Division. Wick Turson, Sedgwick Turson, warrant officer, chief warrant officer. He wrote a book called Talking with Charlie. And Wick gave me a copy of that book and says, you need to read this because I've never told anybody about this. So Wick, during the war, had an opportunity to interrogate one of the, quote, attackers from the North Vietnamese Navy who supposedly attacked, I think it was a destroyer, in the Gulf of Tonkin with some torpedoes, and that's supposedly what led to the Vietnam War. Said it never happened. Never happened. Totally fabricated. So that means we went to war and had so many people die on both sides just so people could profit. And the Johnson family to this day are extremely wealthy as a result of what their father did with Vietnam. And if you read the history and you hear the history of LBJ, that his criminality goes all the way back when he was just a senator back in Texas, is discussing there's 7 people who are attributed, their murders are attributed to his direction. This is how evil we've gotten into a situation where, again, we're talking about, like, there's the country we admire and love that's depicted in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And then there's the country that we are constantly being reminded that there is the ideal of people and a nation, and then there's the reality. And it's up to our diligence. And this is actually what our founding fathers warned us, our diligence of keeping ourselves on the right path and not letting it being hijacked by some very evil people.
Well, I want to ask you because people listening, I've interviewed people in the Ukraine. I interviewed a woman
Mm,
who shared her story about her mom in the Holocaust.
yeah.
What happens a lot of time is if people hear you say something like about war in this way, or, this was fabricated, whatever, it can be easy for people to say, okay, and it's understandable because they've been through this very emotional, hard thing. But it can be very quick for people to say, well, then that means you are trying to say that, like, the Holocaust, like, that was important and we needed to get involved. And if you're saying this about the war and, like, World War II and we were set up for this, and, like, you're saying that it wasn't important enough for people to come and rescue us and help us through these awful things that the Nazis were doing. And I think it's easy for people to then label, okay, you just don't care. You're just
Mhm.
trying to say that everything's made up and that these horrible things haven't really happened. And so I just want to clarify, as people are listening to you, that you've experienced so many things firsthand and have talked to so many people that you're not saying, no, I'm erasing all these things that don't happen, but you're saying that a lot of the bad things that do happen in this world are started by greed or by people who desire to move the pieces so that a certain
Yep,
piece can get in. But you're
yes,
not saying that it's wrong to help people who are in
no.
distress.
I spent my 20s trying to. I became a combatant in El Salvador because I witnessed an atrocity committed by the FMLN. That's when I said I can't carry a camera anymore, because every time I come back and I tell you what's happening, you don't want to report it because it makes the guerrillas look bad. And I'm going, makes the guerrillas look bad. It doesn't matter if the guerrillas are doing this, then it should be reported. So they cut the hand off a farmer because they don't want him collecting coffee, picking coffee, because the monies that would be gathered through the taxation of that coffee would then come around and back at the guerrillas as ammunition. So that's why they did it, and they used him as an example. And I'm saying to myself, well, wait a minute. What's the difference between that and these bodies that I'm seeing in the ditch that are killed by the death squads? Where I'm not going to talk about it because it's horrific. I don't think your listeners would want it. I mean, you can go read about what the death squads did, or why, like Dabuizon, his nickname was the Torch, and how he tortured people. They call him the Torch because he's using a acetylene torch. It's disgusting. So this is how horrific it can get, and where people can be allowed. It's almost like, well, okay, these are the most depraved things you're not allowed to do, but it's war, so now it's okay.
Yeah.
And all sides will do it. And then it gets to a point. So which side am I going to fight for? Because we're done now. I'm not going to report anymore. I'm going to start fighting. And I started fighting, and I got quote recruited, and I was given an opportunity to go and do that. But that was a point in my life that I would not go back to, but I would in my own country. If I see that kind of level of depravity happening in this country, which I hate to say it, we're getting ready. People say, oh, you're talking about civil war in this country. Yeah, there's going to be civil war in this country. And I understand it because personally, I have personal relations to the original civil war in this country that happened in the 1700s. And I read the history of what happened and how my family got involved in it. There's David Graham, his son Andrew are my direct eighth generation away grandfathers. And there's reference in that family tree to a Matthew Graham. And it's only a blip. Well, the blip is interpreted by the author of that family tree, who says it was very likely that he was murdered by Tories. And then it makes sense. Because right now we have conditions that are actually much, much, much worse for the people and the citizens that were ever experienced in 1700 by the citizens, the British citizens. And yet people are just sitting by and not doing a dang thing. And I understand that because we get free food, we're taken care of, we're not hungry, we're not starving. And most importantly, this is the lesson I learned from every war that I've been in, studied, and that is people don't start fighting until they start losing their children. When they start losing their continuation of genetics, their family name, that's when they fight. But up until then, which is actually, if you have a power elite who knows how to play this game, and you can just stay short of the children dying, whether it's starvation or war or murders, they're okay. They won't do anything. But when they do that, and this is the sad thing, is by the time you do that, as evidenced by what happened in the American Revolution / Civil War, that was so late into the events. I mean, the Boston Massacre had occurred. All these other massacres had occurred. But
Yeah.
it wasn't until the Battle of Lexington, which was another massacre for the rebels, that's when people started fighting, because it was pretty atrocious. And the only reason the fighting was people who survived that battle were waiting along the road as the redcoats were working their way back, and they were just being picked off. Everyone's being picked off. And that is actually noted as, quote, the beginning of kinetic conflict, which is interesting to note as we watch what's been happening. We've been in a global war, world war, between the United States, deep state, and Russia for the last 2 years, and in the proxy of Ukraine. And you wouldn't know that unless you're watching the news. When is
Well,
it over? And it flips over like it did in World War II. Flips over when it did slightly in Vietnam, Korea. Nobody even knew about Korea. My dad's generation, they were losing the number of Americans that got killed in Korea, either by battle or just being insufficiently supplied. They had they were fighting in the winter with summer gear.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Cork, one thing that forgive me, it's gonna be a little bit of tangent, but I promise it's gonna circle back. The I remember going to Israel when I was a teenager. I was really
Mm-hmm.
excited, and it was a gift to go. Um, and we visit Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum there. And our tour guide was pretty profound because he circled through, he showed us all these things, and we got to the end, and there was like a Nazi uniform, and I remember there being different pictures. And I think one of us, maybe it was me, I don't know, some student was like, "How could people do this? This is awful." And which a valid question, right? I mean, everyone, ever since you learn about these things, that's what you say. And he turned and he looked at us and he said, "You do know that if you had been in Germany at this time and was learning these things, you'd be a Nazi, most likely. You do understand that, right? Like there is like we always are like, wow, this is such a horrific thing. I would never do that." And it's like, well, he said, if you were born in that time and you were learning those things and you had the propaganda of that time against the Jews, you probably would have. He's like, so you have to realize that as much as there is evil in the world and people do evil and they have to be responsible for that evil, you can never think you're not capable of that evil yourself if you're in that time living among those people. And I remember that sticking with me. And then I remember years later, now we have this huge conflict overseas in the Middle East. And what's been really hard for me is I've had people ask me, what side are you on? And what do you think about this? And I just say, you know what? My heart breaks because there are so many people on both sides that are dead. Like you just, wherever you're gonna go, they're gone. And there's this, it seems like if you're on one side or the other, it's like, yeah, this is great. We're winning, we're getting this. And I'm like, do you realize though, like all these people are dead? Like, why is that why are we happy that one side in particular is winning over, and it's okay that somehow this side can kill all these people and that's fine. But then when it's your side, it's like that's terrible that they killed them. That they couldn't do that. It's like, but they just did that over here. And I think what's really hard for me is in this world we're in now, and I think more and more people are starting to think about this because they're like starting to go, this is hypocritical. But point being is like you've experienced war and you were talking about the attraction of it earlier, and then you're like now it's like you see the suffering on all these ends. And it's really hard for me. Like, I know there is evil. I know that there are things that have to be destroyed. I understand that. But it's really hard for me to ever be able to go, yeah, it's okay that you just wiped out a million people. You know, no worries. That's fine. It's really hard, even for whatever side it's on. It's just sad that there has to be such loss of life for there to be considered a victory on one side. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just
It,
been something that is really, when I was young, I don't want to say programmed, because I want to be kind and thoughtful, because I really do think a lot of people just have been grown up this way. But in the Christian culture, especially, like I was telling you earlier, you had to believe certain things.
mhm,
And then and that was to be a Christian, was to be all of these things together. And then as I started growing up, I was like, no, that's not even biblical. And you're
mhm,
telling me that I need to believe this. And then if I would share that with someone who was also a Christian,
mhm,
it'd be like, how could you say something like that? How could
mhm.
you do that? How could you? And I'm like, that has been for me the most frustrating. And sometimes I will just sit back and I have cried because I've been like, this is Like, where is the humanity in people that we have forgotten that the person that, you know, the Palestinian kid that's in the river dead or whatever, that kid was eating. That kid
Yeah,
or the Israeli kid that is dead because of a bomb. They were playing in the park. They were probably thinking about what they were going to eat for lunch or maybe what mom had just told them in the morning. But it just becomes a number eventually, and then we're all okay with that. And I think that's one reason why I've wanted to talk to war correspondents is because, like, I'm just reading this and that's how affected I get, but you see it. And I just wish we could think a little bit more deeply about that because, like you said, I think we do love wars, you know? And I just don't know why.
well, Michael Yon, do you know Michael Yon? You've heard his reporting from like during. Okay, so Michael, he's the same age as me, but our lives were switched. So he did the military with the Green Berets, and then he became a foreign correspondent. And we started talking when he was. I joke, he said, "Yeah, that's when you're trying to get shot by the police in Hong Kong when he was reporting on the Chinese takeover of Hong or the strengthening of the control over Hong Kong by the CCP." And I've always told him, I said, "You got to stop this, man. You just got to stop because you're going to die. You just got to stop doing this because there's a point where you're not doing anything of worth. You're just regurgitating what you see, and everybody knows what you see if they really look, because there's reporting, and then you can go through the reports. And so I don't have to go to places now. I will be going to places to look for myself to see how things have changed. But um, that's just looking at the cosmetic change, because there's the guttural inner identity of lands and peoples that never change.
Yeah.
Like the joke that I used to say, Asia, like you could take a Khmer, a Lao, Thai, Viet, put them in a room with a machete, come back and all will be dead. That's what those people are to each other. That's their attitude. They may be polite in a business environment when they're negotiating, visiting, but if they're hungry and they have to fight, they will fight from the identity of who they are, whether they're Khmer, Thai, Lao, whatever. That's their deep essence of who they are on a physical plane in this world. Now, Michael, he's going and doing these places, and I'm going, you just got to do what I'm doing, man. You've done it. You've covered this, and it's going to keep on going, and it's not going to matter. But he wants to be there to the end. He wants to be the guy that's on the Titanic when it's going down. And I hate to say it, but I tell people, this is not like a Great Depression. This isn't another world war. This is a civilization collapse. And it's a set up civilization collapse. And the way this happens is because we don't have the wherewithal that our previous generations had. I'll give you an example of that just right now. How many people know how to cook?
Were you here early this morning? Did you have my breakfast? How did you know that?
Yeah, we were talking about fire. You got to learn. I got to hook you up with EJ. You got to learn how to start a fire. You
Hey,
ever cook?
that was off the record. You just now all my listeners know I don't know how to start a fire. I don't know why you just did that. That was hateful.
I
That
mean, this is
was.
Girl Boy Scouts. It's like, what do they teach? And that's not even a joke, because what are they teaching in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts nowadays? Because when I was the Cub Scout, I knew jungle fighting as a kid because I went in Cub Scouts in Singapore, and they hooked us up with the New Zealand, the Kiwis. So the Kiwis always have a military detachment. So the Australians and New Zealand's, the Malaysians, they all had a military detachment in Singapore. And so the YMCA and Cub Scouts would always hook us up during holidays and send us to this island. And so this was like Survivor Island. And they trained us basically. As I got older and I actually went through jungle warfare training, they taught us. So I knew jungle warfare training. So this is how kids were trained. from my early years. And then I talked to my dad. I was, oh yeah, when I was a Cub Scout and a Boy Scout in Spokane in the 1930s, we knew how to hunt deer, and we knew how to prep that deer and get it ready to go, and we knew how to cook that deer. Now people are so conditioned to go to Mickey D's and get their food prepared. They don't know. So a mother doesn't even know how to cook for her children, and the children don't know. I wondered. Um, this is actually an article I'm working on. Where did this start for my dad? And I found an article. Was it Atlantic Monthly? I think it was Atlantic from 1930, which gave a list of everything a man should know. And it talked about you should speak two languages, you should know how to ride a horse, you should know how to shoot, and you need to know how to cook. So my dad would
That's
teach.
incredible.
What's that?
I'm sorry, that's incredible.
Yeah. So that everybody was conditioning everybody to be independent. And this is why I'd mentioned that Dodd report and the Reese Committee. And I implore people to read that Dodd report. It's easy to download. It's from 1954. And also is the interview with Edward G. Griffin, who interviewed Norman Dodd 2 years before he died. And he showed how the foundations were moving us from what made America. See, when I was a kid, you always heard American individualism. I haven't heard that in decades. It's American individualism. And the reason is because we've been moved from individualism towards collectivism. And people don't understand the difference between, well, what is collectivism as compared to individualism? Individualism is the idea, which is actually defined in the Constitution, which is you are free as a human being to your own rights and decisions that are quote God-given, are yours. They can't be taken away from you by a government. To what a collectivism is, which is we'll all pull you together and we will tell you what's best for you. And that's where we've been pushed over decades. And we're not even aware of it. But when I read that, I think it was the Carnegie Fund, the Carnegie Endowment paid. They went to a historian in 1933. They went to the most famous historians of that time, which were Charles and Mary Beard. And they wrote mainly the U.S. history textbooks of that time. And I found it online. I downloaded that book, Basic U.S. History, because I haven't even read it. Just because I want to know what they were teaching before, what my dad got when they still taught civil. I forgot. So when I was talking about the university, my dad, when I was in university, I said, "Hey, Dad, what do you think? Should I take this?" And I've got an elective. I've got Native American history, and I've got critical thinking. Oh, and I got East Asian philosophies. And my dad
Oh
just
my
whipped through.
gosh, are you serious though? I didn't even get that.
Oh yeah, San Francisco. But this is university. And my dad, when I told him critical thinking was being offered, it was the first time I've been offered critical thinking, was in university, and it was an elective. He said, "Whoa." When I went to high school, it was a requirement. We got it in high school, is what he told me. So they were prepping you because they knew that you most likely would not go to university if you went to high school in the 1930s and the 1940s. But they
Right.
wanted to make sure that you were a critical thinking human being, a citizen, who would be able to discern between the different parties and be able to vote based on your own understanding of what you felt was right, as compared to what propaganda might play on you. That's what critical thinking is supposed to be, is the ability to look at propaganda and say, you know what? I don't believe you because what you just said previously doesn't jive with what you just said just now. That's the ability of critical thinking. We don't get that anymore. Now it's based on emotion. We're supposed to respond on emotion. And that's why all this, what used to be journalism, is now propaganda. It's all there to hit your heartstrings. And I hate to say it, really got going in Vietnam. That's why they started throwing these images. And, I've taken my own images like that because they're emotionally affecting. And they're the ones that win the awards. So that's what we get conditioned to take those and use those, when in actuality it's just like, what's really happening here? What is happening in the Middle East? What is really happening in Ukraine? Why is it happening? Why
Yeah.
did that get going? But if you talk, it's because Russia attacked. Well, why did Russia attack? Because we broke our promises. We said we would never expand under Clinton. We said, don't worry, we will not expand NATO. And why do we have NATO when NATO was created against the Soviet Union? There is no Soviet Union. Russia is not communist. If anything, it's a dictatorship, and he's trying to create his own czardom, but that's Russia. Has nothing to do with us. And that's the thing about it. It's not isolationism. Why does Switzerland not get the big rap of being isolationist? They never get involved in anything. This is the first time they got involved. They got into NATO. But nobody ever said anything about that. And who was one of the biggest profiteers for selling arms and building arms? Switzerland. Sweden, Switzerland were some of the biggest manufacturers of arms. And I'm not talking about like hunting and fishing kind of guns. I'm talking about like war armaments. They are the biggest producers and the biggest profiters. Yet they come off as like, oh, we're the peaceful nation. We're neutral. They're neutral, but they're selling the best stuff for everybody else to kill each other with. Nobody talks about that. But we talk about we don't want to get involved. It's like, oh, well, that's so wrong. You should be getting involved in every war in the world.
Well,
But you were asking.
it's interesting because you were mentioning about the photographs, and I did interview, I think it was about a year ago now, the napalm girl in that photograph,
Oh, yeah. Book. Yeah. Yeah.
and just like hearing, you see that picture, and it's become so iconic. But
Yeah. Nikki, the one who took that picture, he's a friend of mine. If
yeah,
you're, did you talk? Have you?
yes.
Yeah.
I know who he is, and I'd love to have him on the show, but I think at the time I sent the request, it wasn't perfect timing for him. But it was just like hearing how she came to this point of like, I'm gonna commit suicide. I was so
Yeah.
miserable, and you're like, anyway, it's like you said, it's sad and hard, and I also just feel bad because it's confusing because there's so many, like you said, journalists, and they all say something different. And really, literally, you're like, you know what? Like, I literally just need to go there myself and then come back and figure out what's going on. Like, that's how you feel. You're like, I just need to go there, talk to people, and then I'll know what's actually happening. Or at
And
least
that's,
a fragment of what's
yeah,
actually happening, you know?
that's the other reasons that I went when we're
Yeah.
talking about why did I go and do these things? Because I needed to see for myself. Because I lived through Vietnam during the war, and I saw the reporting, and I go, wait a minute. And I would talk to friends. Well, this happened and this happened. I said, where did you get that? That wasn't happening. I mean, there were news articles that were totally contrived. A friend of mine, he was in El Salvador, and he said, yeah, remember that picture? It was like a bunch of dead peasants, a bunch of dead campesinos under a tree. He was there. They were they were working in the fields. They came back and they laid down and were taking a nap. But the photograph that was taken was to make it look like it was a massacre. That's how that's how bad it gets. When you see this and you hear these stories over and over and over again. But we were talking about what was it emotionally going back to Vietnam in my childhood. And this is important for understanding of the difference between a historical event, a historical fact, and a personal impact. I do write this book, Chess, which is um, my father and I being on top of our home during the first Tet Offensive and watching the battle and seeing a rocket come in and firing rocket, a U.S. Army chopper coming in right over Saigon, metropolitan of the Paris of Southeast Asia, and firing rockets into a machine gun nest by the Viet Cong who are in the fourth floor of this high rise, which is nothing in relation to what Saigon looks like now. It'll be like little, 6-story apartment building, which would be the high rise at that time, and blowing it out with these rockets. And I looked at it and I made the comment to my dad, oh, look at the fireworks. So it's distant. It's stuff that you would see on TV if you don't hear the screaming and the responses to it. And then we jump further, and even seeing a dead body, like the first time I wrote about it in my Substack is the first article I wrote in my Substack, where I talk about seeing a dead guy and how many of the dead I've seen over my lifetime. But something I never mentioned in that is Seeing dead people, I hate to be crass, but it really doesn't have that effect of it might to other people, and maybe it does. Which you see a dead person, and it's just a dead person. It's a it doesn't have an emotional impact. It may seem horrific, but it's just a dead body. Like if you were to see a dead dog, you'd feel bad. You see a dead dog on the side of the road that got ran over. It's a dead corpse. It's a piece of meat. I hate to say that, but when the person is dying and screaming, that's when it's different. And especially if they're asking for help, and you're either trying to help or you can't help. That's where it nauseates. And that was introduced to me as a child when I went to of all the weird things. Like, I mean, how many people in my generation have their tonsils because they used to take our tonsils out if you got sick? Oh, get rid of your tonsils. But I had my tonsils taken out at the army base, at the army hospital, and that's the initial understanding of trauma of war, which is to look at the people who have been wounded in the war and who were in. See, they weren't supposed to put me. The nurse that put me in there, I guess, was told not to put me there right after my surgery. They're supposed to take me right back into a room that I shared with another serviceman who was there, and we would talk. And he was probably delighted to be able to talk to a young kid, and not have to deal with all these other guys in a war and being, in the military and all kind of stuff. But I woke up and still drugged out from the anesthesia and seeing all the wounded, civilian wounded, the Vietnamese
Mm.
wounded. And that's what hit me. And to this day, it still hits me.
And you were how old then? The
Seven,
tonsils? 7?
six or seven. Yeah. So, and that's the thing. That's why I say, a lot of times when people say, I saw things that even adults should not see, but I saw it at childhood, which is interesting because people say, how did you get recruited by the agency as a paramilitary officer? Most of the time they always pick people who are military and former special forces and all kind of stuff. I already had 2 years of combat by the time I went into being accepting the recruitment. And I'd already understood what war was about. So when you're at that point, you don't have the shock. And that's the thing I say is everybody has that shock. The question is, when do you have it? Do you have it when you're 7 years old or 6 years old and you watch a war and then you experience it again when I was 18 with the kid in Laos, and then it's emotional, you know, where you connect with people, and that's the other thing too. It's when it's not only people asking for help, but people who you are emotionally connected to, even if you just met them for the first time the day before. You've now got a bond to this person, and then this person is killed or maimed, and you're trying to help them get back from that, and you feel compelled to do something about it. And everybody who is raised to be empathetic, which most people are. I mean, we are. I think human beings are born empathetic to other souls on this planet. That we're here going through these trials that we personally have, that we have to get through. And when you get through that, you get a wisdom, and that's where wisdom actually comes from. That's why I get concerned when I hear people talking about how life is and they've never left the white halls of a university, and they talk about history, but they've never gone to Vietnam and talked to people who are in combat. They never talk to the people, or they just go and look at the physical. Well, this was the battlefield, and there's a tank, and well, this is where they had the fighting. But they don't actually talk to somebody and says, what was it like, when you realized that your whole family had been wiped out?
It's
What
scary.
was,
That's
yeah,
why it's hard,
it's hard.
because you don't know what they're gonna say, and
Yeah,
you're like, it's gonna be awkward, and
and it's
yeah.
but
No, I was just gonna say, Cork, I have to wrap up, but
oh yeah,
thank you so much. I think this has been such a great interview, and I do encourage people, Cork has so many resources. He's got his website, he's got socials, he's got a Substack now, which he just started up. He's got his books, which are on his website. So I really do encourage you, please. And a lot of the things he's saying as well, please research as he encourages critical thinking. This is very important. But Cork, thank you so much for doing this. It was such a gift to talk with you and hear your story. And it's just incredible to me you've gone through all this and have come out with even being able to talk about it with me without having a panic attack.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, Cork, thank you so much, and I hope you have a good day. And yes, get me in touch with the man to teach me how to make a fire.
I will. EJ, he's the guy.
All right, bye.
Bye.